In the US, Donald Trump has won the state of Arizona in the presidential election, flipping the state which voted for Joe Biden in 2020. The win comes after 4 days of counting. Arizona has a large Hispanic population, and the Republicans' victory there locks in his sweep of all 7 swing states. Trump is now in line to win 312 electoral votes compared to 226 for the Democratic candidate, Vice President Kamala Harris. For some analysis, let's bring in William Glucroft, U.S. analyst and deputy editor of Parliament magazine. William, despite a criminal conviction, 2 impeachments while in office, and warnings from his former chief of staff, Trump managed to win all 7 battleground states. The last one to achieve that, to my knowledge, was Ronald Reagan 40 years ago. How did Trump manage that?
Right. And of course, swing states changed, certainly in the span of 40 years since Ronald Reagan. But to your point, Donald Trump had a very convincing message. And essentially, we're reminded of what a large body of political science literature will tell you, that trying to run on a campaign of saving democracy or preserving democracy doesn't really land well with average voters. They want to talk about the economy. They want to talk about security and law and order. They want to talk about schools and healthcare and other kinds of national security interests, maybe, although foreign policy doesn't, play very well in elections. And the Kamala Harris campaign kept going after this democracy question, this dictatorship question. And that clearly just didn't, land very well with most voters who, as I say, wanted to talk about other issues, which the Harris campaign seems to be, and as we look back now, was quite light on.
Now, this is actually a very decisive victory for Donald Trump. How do you think this will affect Trump's agenda?
Well, I'm reminded of the 2004 victory of George W. Bush. Remember, like Donald Trump, George Bush also didn't win the popular vote in 2000, and his first term was somewhat contested. People didn't really see him as a legitimate president, and the same thing with Donald Trump. And then, like George W. Bush in 2004, came back with a mandate, with the popular vote. And in Donald Trump's case right now, quite a bit. If memory serves, Joe Biden won a pretty good victory in 2020 with 306 electoral votes. Donald Trump now has 312 electoral votes. That said, he's won by a popular vote margin of about the same. 74 million Americans voted for Donald Trump this time around as they did last time around. Nonetheless, it is a majority. It is a clear signal, not just to Donald Trump, but to the Republican Party, that they have a mandate to govern. And you can expect them to do that because the Republican Party has a very long track record of acting like they've won and governing like they've won and passing legislation and implementing policies that they see fit. And I think we can expect very much of that going forward.
Now, what do you think will be Trump's main priorities?
Well, if we can believe what he said on the campaign trail, and again, we always have to have the caveat that Donald Trump is highly unpredictable, makes decisions on the fly, might not listen to his advisors, and it really goes with the gut. We've seen this on the campaign trail. But if we are to go with some of the things he said, we can expect more tax cuts for the rich, much like he did in his first term. We could see possibly more tariffs against China, even against the European Union. These are things that he said are very important for him and for, quote unquote, making America great again. Of course, lots of economists have some doubts about that, but that's what we can probably expect going forward.
William Glucroft there, U.S. politics analyst. Thank you very much, William.
Let's bring in Justin Higgins. He's a communications consultant who's worked for both the Democratic and the Republican Party. Justin, good to see you. Now, despite a criminal conviction, 2 impeachments, warnings from Trump's former staff, and talk about Democrats as the enemy within, he managed to win all 7 battleground states. How did he pull that off?
Yeah, so from a macro perspective, this was a historically difficult cycle for incumbents, meaning being the challenger, Donald Trump, was advantageous. I believe since World War II, this was the first time that incumbents across the globe lost vote share. And then drilling down a little further, he was able to win 45% of Latino voters, the highest in history for GOP candidate. 51% of white women also voted for Trump. Now, why was he able to accomplish this? He messaged to these voters telling them that the cost of living increases from the pandemic was Biden's fault and it was hurting them. And then he provided clear solutions like ending taxes on tips, overtime rules, and putting tariffs on foreign goods, which, while he was being dishonest about it, voters believed would help the economy. And the other two things that he really leveraged was he promised to fix America's immigration problem and tied that to the economy and crime. And then lastly, he ran against progressive, liberal social justice policies in a way that resonated with these voters.
There was a lot of optimism in the Democratic Party, especially after Biden dropped out of the race. What did the Harris-Walz campaign get wrong?
Well, Biden stayed into the race far too long. He was a historically unpopular candidate. And then when asked if they would do anything differently than President Biden did, VP Harris and Walz basically said no. So they tied themselves further to the president, historically unpopular president. They also used President Biden's message of democracy being on the ballot as the central focus of this campaign. And while that's true, it's really Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If voters are worried about the price of bacon, eggs, gas, and rent, they are going to vote on that before something that some voters perceive as a luxury, like the system of government. And then a couple other reasons is they told voters the economy was fine. It was doing great. They offered no clear prescriptive policy solutions. When you're the VP for 4 years, you have control of the House of Representatives and Senate, and you do absolutely nothing on immigration, something that voters prioritize. That will come back to hurt you. And then lastly, the Democratic Party has been pushing away young men for 8 years. The Trump campaign has been saying that under the Trump campaign, they will protect young men. They will make it better for young men. And quite frankly, the Harris campaign did no type of messaging to this vital demographic bloc. And that's why you saw 45% of Hispanic voters go for Trump.
Yeah, just to add on to something that you said there, the Biden administration, of course, tried to get something done as to the situation on the U.S. southern border, but it was blocked in Congress. But I do want to move on because there is a lot to unpack here. This now is the landslide that Trump has been seeking for the last 4 and 8 years. How do you expect this to affect his agenda?
Well, it'll keep him out of prison, first and foremost. But from an agenda perspective, I think the world has to be ready. There's very likely to be tariffs. It's one of the main things that President Trump has been consistent on for 40 or 50 years now. We can expect him to support Israel expansion into Gaza. We can expect him to support, quite frankly, an unfavorable ending to the war in Ukraine. The J.D. Vance plan is to give Russia all of the territory that Ukraine holds now in exchange for peace. We know that Vladimir Putin is a thug that cannot be trusted. So any type of negotiation for that is just setting up for a future invasion or expansion thereof. And then the last two issues here are we can expect corporate tax cuts, so income inequality to expand in the United States. And then lastly, and maybe one of the most tragic things we can expect is mass deportations. Do they start with just a few 100,000 people, or do they try and round up 10 to 15 million people and put them in detention camps and then fly them out? So America and the world better be ready for a very, very different type of leadership from the United States. And I'd just like to end with maybe America is not as exceptional as us Americans and patriots like myself like to believe.
Yeah. It's an uncertain time ahead for many people in the United States and around the world, certainly. Donald Trump famously promised to be a dictator on day one. What is that going to look like?
Well, we need to understand that he does have authoritarian impulses, but he also has the attention span of maybe an 8-year-old child. So we can't project anything with certainty. But I don't think he's going to be able to be a dictator because we do have a strong system of governments going back to the spirit of laws by the French philosopher Montesquieu, and our court system is still intact. So what could it look like? It could look like Trump doing executive orders to subvert the will of Congress, take money that is maybe earmarked for disaster relief and putting it towards deporting people. I personally do not think we are going to see the end of free and fair elections. We're not going to see necessarily the prosecution of political enemies, but maybe some tinkering at the edges, which will be challenged and hopefully overturned by the courts.
Many people hoping that you're correct in your assessment. Justin Higgins, U.S. politics analyst, thank you so much for your time.